Okay, good morning to everybody, and welcome to class. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let me see if the transcription is working here. It looks like it is. And so we'll go ahead and get started with today's class. Obviously, we missed class on Thursday last week because it's a snow day, and I actually came all the way to campus and I didn't even notice that I had a text and couldn't get in the building. So as it turns out, I couldn't broadcast the. If I could have gotten in, I probably would have gone ahead and had the virtual class, but the building was locked and the campus was closed down, unfortunately. But that's okay, because chapter 11 is the chapter that we were going to sort of tag on to the end of the segment, and it doesn't look like we're going to get there. And I've got only a few comments about chapter 10 because we'll be talking more about excuse me, about the international piece a bit later. Excuse me. Chapter 11, I'm going to sort of open the door just a little bit here in just a minute to some of the content that's in that particular chapter. But the main event for today is to review for the second exam, which is coming up this week. It'll be available on Thursday. The exam is mostly done, so it's mostly available to. It'll be available to you on Thursday after class is over, and it'll be the same format as before. It'll be a 90-minute exam. You'll have 40 questions. 40 multiple choice questions. You can do it in Brightspace. You can do it physically in class at 9 o'clock on Thursday, or you can go to one of our testing centers, whichever you prefer. That's entirely up to you as to what your preference is. So most people did it on Brightspace last time. I presume that's where most people will be this time. Also, you notice that there was a new Zoom link. I think it's a new Zoom link. I had to set up a new one at least. Those Zoom links that we set up, even though I set up as recurring, they don't last forever. So just as a reminder, make sure that if you're going to join the live feed that you check your announcements and or your email for the link to this session, because it will change. And hopefully this one, I've pushed it back far enough that it'll take us to the end of the semester, but I can't be sure of that. It's not completely clear how long I can keep that as a recurring meeting, because it looks like I do have to refresh that. So, okay, so are there questions for me? From looks like we have a number of people in the live room here. Are there questions for me about anything that I can answer before we get going here today? Okay, because I can see when people raise their hands and whatnot. But well, feel free to chime in or put something in the chat box, or you can just go ahead and speak up, and I usually hear you. I had some audio issues yesterday, and I hope that I was able to address those. It's the same room that I recorded this one in. So. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. What I want to do is just really briefly cover just the last fragment of information dealing with inflation, which I believe is chapter 9. And when we're talking about inflation, and then I'll get into some of the content of chapter 10. When we're talking about inflation, we define it as a general rise in the overall price level, not generally associated with one or two goods like oil or interest rates or milk or something like that. And so we're saying that that's essentially what's going on, is that we've got a rise in all prices throughout the economy. And it's a macro phenomenon, not a microeconomic phenomenon. Remember, microeconomics deals with the study of individual markets. This is not an individual market phenomenon. This is the entire economy, where the flip side of this is the explanation for why prices are rising. It's a devaluation of the currency, the money. So if it takes more dollars to buy the same goods next year as it did this year, it means your money is worth less. And so as a result, to keep up with inflation, wage earners and everybody really has to earn more money in order to keep pace, in order to keep their purchasing power afloat, to at least stay on keel. Okay, so that's the issue. But there are two broad forms of inflation that I want to talk about, and they're called demand pull and cost push. And so this is, as I said, sort of a lead into where we're going in chapter 11, but I'm going to return back to something we began back in chapter 3. That is the demand supply model. That is really a microeconomic model, and but it's useful because it will help us sort of explain what's going on with inflation and what are some of the explanations for inflation. And the first kind of inflation that we'll talk about is this notion of something called demand pull inflation. And that is where we've got demand shifting to the right. And we'll call that D prime. And so as a result, what happened is, for any particular situation where you've got some equilibrium already set up here, and we'll call that P. And you've got a rightward shift in demand. And as a result, it's pulling up, it's pulling up more output, but it's also pulling up prices. And so we'll call that P prime, and we'll call this Q prime here, Q and Q prime. These are all equilibrium conditions still. So I could put the stars by there, I guess I could, but the main issue is though the demand is rising. So it's really the very definition of too many dollars chasing too few goods. The supply side is not able to catch up. If it were, it would shift to the right and bring the price level down, as you see, which is why I kind of would like for everybody to think right, left, up, down. If the supply curve would shift to the right and bring the price level down. But what about when the supply level cannot react quickly? And I think this is part of what we're seeing at the moment is we've had lots of stimulus to the economy in the last couple of years, and we've had a reduction in supply, really, which is actually more of this shift, but also a rightward shift in demand. And we've got rising prices. We're at about 7% inflation rate annually, which is high. Considering where we've been in the last 40 years, I mean, really, when you see on the news, this is the highest we've had in inflation in 40 years. It really is. I mean, the U.S. has been maybe lucky, maybe it's good management, economic policy management by a succession of different Federal Reserves, but we've been pretty lucky. But this is an example of demand pull inflation, which I think most economists would say is the most common form of inflation. Usually it's caused by something stimulating demand. And oftentimes the culprit, if you want to refer to it this way, is government spending. And I don't mean to suggest that all government spending is bad or that it's not useful, because that's clearly not a very realistic explanation. But a lot of times it's a government spending issue that drives the inflation. The last inflation that we had really was the late 70s, early 80s, where it was about a double-digit inflation in the early 80s. And a lot of that was due to simply the fact that government was pouring on demand and had been really for the better part of 20 years prior. There were a number of different programs which government had been engaged in. The space program, lots of expansion of social programs, higher education, healthcare, military spending, that sort of thing. So as a result, we had lots of inflation throughout the 60s and the 70s, in particular the 1970s. In fact, if from an economist's perspective, the economic story of the 1970s was inflation, just rampant inflation that couldn't be stopped. A lot of it because of simply excessive aggregate demand. And we will talk about how that inflation came to go away, and it was some painful medicine. And we'll talk about who the actor was that did that. It was the Federal Reserve and why they did that. But one thing I want to do here is to sort of expand on, well, let me come back to the expanding on this. Demand pull inflation is the first kind of this. The second kind that we should talk about is this. That what if supply shifts to the left? And we have certainly seen some of this happen, haven't we? We've had some supply restrictions. So you've got Q going to Q star or Q prime here. And we've got the price, which started out as P going to P prime. So we've got a rise in the price level and a reduction in the amount of goods available for sale. This is also what we've been seeing lately. And this is, excuse me, my coffee. This is a condition which economists would, I don't know why they don't use the term supply push, but they use the term cost push inflation, which is really a supply induced inflation. It's a reduction in supply for whatever reasons are happening. And today, I think it's easy to understand that the big restriction in supply now is COVID related. There are labor supply shortages that are preventing the flow of goods to meet the demand, which is there and ready to greet it. There are production bottlenecks for all kinds of reasons because of restrictions on the movement of trade. We've certainly seen goods. I mean, we've seen these stories about ships that are sort of lined up, like ducks in a row behind each other in the Pacific Ocean, waiting to dock. There's not enough capacity to unload the freight and to get it onto the dock and to get it onto the trucks. And there are not enough truckers to move the goods and whatnot. And that's why we see some goods that have been sort of stocked out within stores in the last couple of years. And we see this happening, and it's been going on. So as a result, you got to wonder, to what extent do we have some cost push inflation going on right now? And I think what this explanation for our current state of inflation is, it's really a combination of both. It's demand pull because we've had some stimulus to the economy through tax cuts, through enhanced and advanced tax credits. Advanced meaning that they're moved up. You can get them ahead of time, not when you file your returns. All these stimulus payments that people are getting and whatnot. And I know people have lost jobs too, so that's pushing back in the other direction. But there's no doubt that there's been stimulus going on, and we've got the federal deficit to prove that, the budget deficit. But we also know there's some supply issues. And I think this is where the government's been saying for a long time, hey, this is only temporary, this is going to go away in a few months once we get all these supply kinks worked out. Once we get these bottlenecks worked out in the system, the goods will flow and the price level will come down because supply will shift to the right. They've sort of stopped talking about that because it really hasn't happened yet. So I do think this was probably the initial cause of our present inflation, but I think it's also been aided a bit by this right here. Now, one thing I want to do to sort of extend this, which is sort of where I opened the door a minute ago, is this. When we talk about macroeconomics, we're going to take a version of the basic market model that we first talked about back in chapter 3. And we're going to simply say, look, what if we're talking about all goods and services in the economy? Because this is a market for whatever, shoes or sweaters or hair dryers or car insurance. I mean, it could be any individual market for any particular good. However, we want to slice and dice that market, whether it's a national market, a regional market, or whatever. What if we take the entire national market for a particular good and say, for all goods, not just for a good actually, but for all goods and services, and we're going to refer to that as aggregate demand, and we'll call that AD, aggregate demand. Aggregate demand basically means all goods and services in the economy. And since we're talking about all goods and services in the economy, and what we're really talking about here is not Q, but what is the value of all goods and services in the economy? It's GDP, isn't it? So we'll simply label that Y for GDP, and Y in this case is going from Y to Y prime. In this case, Y is going from Y to Y prime. And so we'll simply label that as aggregate demand in all these cases. And we'll give a much more concrete definition of that when we get to chapter 11, which will be in the segment coming up in week 9, next week. But I always, as we're coming up on the exam, I don't usually like to get too far ahead of ourselves. So rather have us think about what we're doing now for the upcoming exam. That's the most important thing. So if that's aggregate demand, then what is the supply side? We're simply going to refer to this as aggregate supply. As aggregate supply, that is all supply of all goods and services in the economy throughout a given period of time. All goods and services. We will touch on much more about that as we come back from our second exam. And then the final one here, this axis here, the P is not the price of individual goods, but it's rather the price level. And it's based on some index. And the index is generally something like the Consumer Price Index, or the GDP deflator, or the PCE deflator. There are a number of different, we call them deflators because what do deflators do? They deflate the price level to bring it back to some base year so that apples and apples can be compared in terms of price changes. If all we do is look at the change in price from one year to the next, we can't know whether or not it's a change in price for qualitative reasons or something else, or if it's just inflation, because really inflation is just sort of noise in the system, okay? So those are the two broad forms of inflation. And then finally, we get to the final slide of this package, which takes us to like this, which is like week 6, which is the central conflict of macro policy, which is, as I've said before, policymakers at the federal level are trying to steer the car between the two ditches on either side of the road, the ditch of high unemployment and recession on the one hand, and the ditch of high inflation and excessive growth on the other, and they're trying to keep it in between the lines. Right now, it looks like we're veering off toward high inflation, and with lots of growth, but high inflation. And so as a result, the question is what to do about it. And I suspect that we will know more even later this month, as our Federal Reserve is probably going to start raising interest rates to try to slow borrowing down and to try to encourage savings and not spending. And we'll see how that goes. We'll talk much more about that. I know that I have talked periodically about the Federal Reserve without really having talked about who they are, what they are. And I will get there, I assure you, and because they really are an integral element of macro policy. Okay? All right, so questions for me about any of that? That's just the sort of the wrapping up exercise for the inflation bit, and I would have done that Thursday, but we obviously ran into some issues there. So I want to talk about chapter 10 a little bit here. And chapter 10 is a fairly deep chapter, and I think there are only 4 questions on the exam from chapter 10. So I wouldn't say it's an unimportant chapter, but it's one that's fairly deep, and it gets into a lot of areas that usually in an introductory econ course, I don't usually go that deeply into, but I will talk about some things here because I think it's important for us to know what's going on. And in order to sort of go forward with this, I want to sort of back up a little bit and talk about balance of trade. So, excuse me, this PowerPoint package that I had emailed to you some time ago was for week 7, because I would have covered this last week, dealing with balance of trade. And we talk about this idea of the difference between imports and exports. And we've been talking about this for some time now, where we call exports, which are goods sold to foreign buyers, and imports, which are goods bought from foreign sellers. And what is the difference between these two? And if the exports out of a country exceed the imports into a country, then we say that this country has a trade surplus. Trade surplus. And if it's the opposite condition, where exports are less than imports, we say that that nation, whatever that nation is, has got a trade deficit. And as a result, we say that there's a positive effect on GDP with the trade surplus, right? So GDP tends to be boosted upward. As a result, and GDP tends to be dragged down with the trade deficit. Okay, and that is true. Net exports, sort of meet that characteristic. But there's one other term we should talk about here, and it's going to come up again and again a bit later, and that is the idea of an injection and a leakage. An injection and a leakage. And so when you've got a trade surplus, what's really happening is you've got to boost your economy in terms of income, because remember, gross domestic product is income earned within that particular country, and there's a boost to that when in fact there's a trade surplus. There's a boost to GDP. Foreign buyers are financing more of your output income than you, the country, whatever it is, Canada, Korea, whatever, is financing the output income of foreigners who are selling to that particular country. So as a result, there's a boost to the economy, and so we call that an injection. It's an injection into the economy, so it's sort of a boost to the economy. And there are economies in the world that really stand out, being export-driven economies. I guess really, well, there are more, but Germany and Japan are 2 economies. In fact, your text gets into some special discussion of those, where they have, it's not by accident, it's by deliberate economic choice to decide to be an export-driven economy so that they can earn more income from the rest of the world by focusing on specializing things which those producing countries do best. Germany does a lot of things well, like machine tools and engineering and chemicals and medicines. And Japan does a lot of work with electronics and all kinds of systems like that. And so, and consumer goods, all kinds of consumer goods, like electric consumer goods, electronics, etc. So as a result, they get a boost to their economy from that. And in a country that has a deficit like the United States, it's considered a leakage. So injection, leakage, injection, leakage. And these automotive metaphors appear again and again in economics. And there's the idea that it's this automotive idea, we've got a boost to the economy and a drag on the economy. In other words, a leakage, because the economy is financing the output income of foreign sellers to a greater degree than foreign buyers are financing one's own country's output and income. So it's considered to be a leakage from the economic flow of production and income. Okay, so that's the first thing we should talk about there. But when we talk about the balance of trade, that's only part of the picture, because what we really haven't done here is talk about financial flows, which include this, but include other issues as well. And so we want to talk about something called the current account. Sometimes called the current balance, but it's usually referred to as the current account. And the current account basically has 4 main components, and I will get into these for you here. They're listed in the text, but I'm going to they're listed in your PowerPoints, but I will give you a little bit more detail here on those. So the current account does what? It goes simply beyond the balance of trade in terms of goods and services, and it also gets into the financial flows. And this is something we really haven't gotten into yet, is talking about financial flows. We've alluded to it, well, we've done it within the circular flow model inside the United States. That is, if I go to work as a wage earner, I provide labor, that's that sort of red arrow in the circular flow, and I get paid a wage, that's a green arrow, which I then turn into spending, it's a green arrow, and I get goods back, which is a red arrow. So the green arrows, I notably put them as green in our flow model here, was to sort of denote financial flows. But what we haven't gotten into is something a little bit trickier, and it requires a little bit more precise measurement or more detailed measurement, and that's the idea of worldwide financial flows, which are captured in the current account beyond the trade in goods and services. Now, there are really four components to the capital account or the current account, and one of them is a capital account. First of all, there's the trade in goods, and we talked a bit before about this idea of goods as being distinct from the second category of services, and particularly when it comes to international trade, because we do separate goods and services from each other, because goods have this physical nature of an inventoriable sort of nature, whereas services not so much. Goods, which include all things like oil and clothing and food and whatnot, where services are difficult to put your arms around. You can't put it on a truck and move it. These would be things like engineering services and accounting services, financial services, healthcare, entertainment, those kinds of things. And it's a growing area for the United States. And in some ways, it's a good thing, because when it comes to the injection leakage issue, right, we've got a deficit when it comes to goods, but we've got a surplus when it comes to services. And we've got a big surplus. So in other words, we've got a leakage here, right? And we've got an injection here. Okay, so a leakage and an injection. But then there are some other issues that we should talk, and I'm talking simply here about the United States. We could be talking about any economy in the world. Income receipts minus payments. These are simply financial settlements, right? And basically, we have a positive in this category here. And what it really amounts to is this: it's the net amount of investment income. And here we're talking about investment as being a bit more inclusive than the simple investment that we went to with the C plus I plus G model. We're talking about all investment, financial and economic. So all investment affecting the US economy. So we are talking, and I want to stress we are talking about the US economy. Not all economies would have this same character, where it would have a positive or a leakage, or positive or an injection. Not amount of investment income affecting the economy. This is basically the idea that firms and individuals are earning income overseas, and money is flowing back and forth. And so as a result, nations can benefit from trade in the sense that there are opportunities worldwide that they can take advantage of by simply investing in those particular areas. And so in this case, it happens to be a negative at the moment. And then the final category here is unilateral transfers. Unilateral transfers include lots of different things here. It could be, and it happens to be a negative at the moment, it could be things like government aid. It could be not-for-profit activities, such as charitable giving, those kinds of things. It could be simply a flow of funds. It could be gifts going back and forth. Somebody who lives overseas could be giving a gift. There are lots of countries in the world in which there's lots of migration. It has been for a very long time. Really, it's not a new story ever. The idea of people going to other countries for work, and their families remain back wherever they are, and they will send money back. They'll wire money back to their families. We certainly see this in the Middle East, where lots of workers come from Asia and Africa and work in the oil fields and in construction. There's lots of construction going on in the Middle East. And as a result, wherever they have coming from, they are able to send the money back, and that would be considered a unilateral transfer. Okay. And that's a pretty good amount of money that moves around just in terms of that particular issue. There's a lot going on here with regard to these flow of funds. And I think that we need to be clear that when we add all these up, at the moment, this is a negative the United States. It's actually dragging down the United States. A lot of it had to do with what's called the merchandise trade deficit. And I know your book talks about something that has been the bugaboo of economists for a long time. And that was the idea that reporters who are not specialists in economics will focus on one particular thing, even though it's a way outdated measure, like the merchandise trade deficit. It's only one part of the picture, because there are other financial flows as well that sort of work into this picture. And at the moment, the entire thing is a negative. So they're not terribly off, but they're not giving really the full story here. And in fact, we've only had a positive in this account in the last 60 years, only for a couple of years. And that was during the Gulf War of 1990-91, where a lot of the rest of the world was simply funding and helping to fund the United States war effort in the Persian Gulf against the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. And which led some cynics to say that it was a profit for the United States. And it was not a profit. I don't think that the United States has ever engaged in any sort of war activity for profit. It wasn't a for-profit activity. It certainly cost a lot in lives and other expenditure. But there's no question about the fact that there was a boost in those 2 years because of simply the flow of funds from the rest of the world in order to accommodate and to support the U.S.-led effort to remove the Iraqis from Kuwait. Okay, and today, of course, if you're watching CNN or any of the news channels now, there's lots of talk about the rest of the world punishing Russia for its incursion into Ukraine and sort of shutting down a lot of these sources of funds. These are flows, whereas they flow from certain activities. Those certain activities are sort of now being restricted by the rest of the world, where Russia may have difficulty accessing them. So they may have difficulty getting the flow of money back into Russia. And so that economic story is fascinating. It's unprecedented, the scale of this. I'm a little bit surprised, frankly, that the entire world has reacted so strongly and so firmly against this whole thing. But we will see how that plays out. It's still very early days, I think. Okay, and so then the final bit here talks about net borrowing and net deficits. And this sounds a little bit counterintuitive. And that is, if you're running a trade deficit with the rest of the world, what do you consider to be? Well, in this case, you're considered to be a net debtor, right? A net debtor or a net borrower to the rest of the world. And the reason why is basically simply these goods have to be paid for somehow. And so as a result, a current account deficit means that country is a net borrower for the rest of the world. Whereas if there's a surplus, that country is a net creditor to the rest of the world. Keep in mind, too, that this accounts also for the fact that there is income being earned overseas that sometimes doesn't make its way back to the home country. Instead, that exporting country will simply reinvest earnings from those operations in the country which it's doing business. And we have, in our own country, we've seen foreign producers do that very thing. Japanese automakers, these are Japanese-based automakers, have for many years reinvested earnings in terms of investment in automotive plants. There's a big Honda plant in Marysville, Ohio. There's a Subaru plant in Indiana. I think there's a Honda plant, I think, in California. We're talking about big operations. BMW, which is a German company, has a big operation in South Carolina. And so you get the idea that these earnings don't always make their way back. And so sometimes being a net creditor is a good thing because it allows them to do business within that country. Now, in the case of the Japanese manufacturers, they were pretty smart to have done that because there was a time in the 80s in which the United States was really feeling the heat from the competitive challenge which Japanese car makers were giving the domestic car makers. They were beating them up pretty badly. And so the Japanese automakers agreed to a voluntary quota on the export of cars to the United States. It was not that voluntary. It was basically saying this is what you're going to do. So Japanese car makers, Honda, Toyota, this is X number of goods that you can import. It was really protectionist, and those who were in favor of free trade, who don't like those particular barriers, argued strenuously against it, saying U.S. car makers have simply got to compete better. And a lot of people have been saying that for a very long time, my entire life. I think I've heard that. That is probably true, but nonetheless, those were put in place. So what did the Japanese car makers do? They simply said, well, how about not importing them? How about just simply making them in the United States, making them in Ohio and Indiana, and therefore they are not imported goods at all. It was pretty good, but it also served a dual purpose. It employed Americans in high wage jobs. The earnings didn't all flow back out of the country, which was considered to be a good thing from that standpoint. So in a lot of ways, it was sort of a win-win for both sides. Okay, so the questions for me about anything, that's really all that I wanted to get to with regard to chapter 10. And I think I'll sort of stop there and take some time. I can answer any questions you've got about anything. And then I think what I'll do for the remaining 45 minutes or so is talk about the exam. And I think that's probably where we should go. Let me sort of swivel the camera here this way so you can see me. And not that you need to see me, but there we go. So, okay, so let's talk a bit about the exam here and what to expect. And again, I talked about this a bit earlier as to what the exam is going to be. It's going to be the same format as before. So exam 2 is going to be Thursday, Thursday, the 3rd, so 3/3, 9 to 10:15 if you want to take it in class. That's AM, obviously. Or you can take it online in Brightspace. And I believe everybody in this section did it in Brightspace last time. And if you want to do it that way, that's fine. I did make a little note in my introductory announcement yesterday, which every Monday I just make a note telling everybody, hello, here's where we are, here's where we're going. And then if you want to do it in class, some people prefer to do it in class, which I think is perfectly fine. I have no preference whatsoever, really. Or if you want to take it at the testing center. But I just asked maybe you just let me know, just so I have a copy for you. And then I'm available so that you can sit and take it if you like. You'll still have access to any resource that you want. If you want to bring a laptop or a tablet or whatever to look things up or your notes, that's fine, because everybody at home will be having access to that. So that's not a problem at all. Okay. So if you want to do it, just shoot me an email or text me or whatever. Let me know you're going to be doing that. That's perfectly fine. I suspect most will want to do it in Brightspace because it gives you until Thursday, or I'm sorry, Sunday. Where did I get Thursday? Till Sunday at 11:59 p.m. 11:59, Sunday 3/6, right? March 6th at 11:59 p.m. And then it will go away at that point. So what I would advise you to do really, and it's just friendly advice that is born out of experiences, I wouldn't wait till 11 o'clock on Sunday night to start it. You may, and you may have to if your life is as crazy as some others are, I mean, I know life happens, I get it, and a lot of you work and maybe have families or other responsibilities. And so it may be till Sunday night that you get to it, but I would sort of encourage you to not do that, because being under the gun sort of is a bad way to take an exam. I'd rather be sort of relaxed and, have a chance to really sort of soak up the material and prepare for the exam. That's probably a better way to do it if you're at all able to do that. Okay. So it'll be available and it'll be the same for you. You should get immediate feedback as to your exam score. Oh, one other thing I should mention is that I would strongly encourage you to not use a cell phone or like an iPhone or an Android or even a tablet to take the exam. We've had some issues with that. Some of it having to do with speed and memory and just frankly charging of your equipment, and people get timed out or get knocked out and can't get back in. So I would discourage you from doing that. And plus, I mean, so there are some graphs. They're not a lot, but there are some, and you do have to be able to see them. And so probably a computer is the way you want to go, and a laptop is fine. But I think a computer is the way to go. It's been my experience at least. Okay. All right. So let me see. What else do I want to say about this? Oh, I will have an open Zoom link on Thursday. So if you do have questions, you can pop in. It'll be like an office hour, let's say, or an hour and 15 minutes. So if you have questions, you can pop in and ask your questions. I'll be more than glad to answer anything that you want to talk about. And then as soon as class is over, I'll just simply, flip a switch and make the exam available. for everybody to take at their convenience. And so you've got the rest of the day, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, in order to take it. And I don't believe you can go in and out. I know the old Blackboard system that we used up until a year and a half ago was very picky about that, would not let you go in and out. You got to do it in one sitting. And I think that's the same with Brightspace, but I'm not sure because I really haven't heard. And since and part of the handicap from my standpoint is since I'm not a student, I don't really have the precise view that you do, believe it or not. And so, and I can't actually go in and take the exam. It won't let me take the exam. So I don't know what that looks like. So if you have some experience on that, maybe you can let me know. I guess I could check with our distance learning people and see, but I think it's probably just easiest to take the exam at one time. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the exam. It's going to cover the following. It's going to cover chapters 6, 8, 9, and 10. 6, 8, 9, and 10. And there are only going to be about 4 questions, I think, from chapter 10. They're going to be ones that we have pretty much talked about today. So that should be sort of fresh in your minds as far as that goes. So let's talk a bit about the exam and what to expect. And then you can ask any questions that you've got. So chapter 6 dealt with GDP and GDP accounting, what we call national income accounting. And that was the idea of how do we compute the valuable output produced in an economy in a given year. And that's the very definition of GDP. It's the total dollar value of output produced domestically. That's where the letter D comes from, is domestic production in a given year. So we would not capture the output of an American firm doing business in England, for instance. That would go into the British economy, not into ours. In a British economy doing business here, that output would be considered income because it's done here and it employs American factors and whatnot. So as a result, it would go into US GDP. And even though national income seeks to sort of net those out, what's called net foreign factor income, that is to sort of separate out who is doing the earning from the income standpoint. And by doing that, it sort of sorts out nationalities. But we're not terribly interested in that. Simply put, the definition is total output produced domestically at a given time. And then know about the consumption, the elements of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, those 4 elements of the expenditures approach. Remember, there are 2 approaches to computing GDP. There are actually 3, but we've only covered 2. There's the expenditures approach, which takes it from the demand side. That is the idea of consumption plus investment, which is consumption being household spending, investment, business spending, government spending, and net exports are the elements of spending that constitute GDP from the demand side. So C represents consumer spending, I investment spending by business, G government spending, and net exports is that plug number that balances out exports and imports. Okay, so know about what those are and know about what the relative percentages are of those in the economy. Like consumption is about 2/3 of the economy. Investment varies quite a lot. But sort of have an idea of what those look like in terms of what they're about, etc. And also know about within the elements of those. So with consumption, you've got consumption of what are called durable goods, goods expected to last greater than 3 years. Non-durable goods, which are goods that will not last that long, things like food and and perishable items and whatnot. A lot of household items. And durable goods will last long, and then also services. So you want to know about those particular kinds of components. Okay. Let me see here. Okay, and then know like what would an example of a durable good be? Something like a washing machine would be a durable good. A piece of furniture, television, those kinds of things would be durable goods that are expected to last 3 years. We said that they're sort of big ticket items, and again, that's relative to other goods, other consumer goods are considered to be relatively big ticket. Okay, and then know about what we're counting in that GDP number. It's the final goods and services that are being produced. So intermediate goods do not get accounted for Because if we accounted for all the production of wheat, then we'd be double counting wheat and then all the products are made from wheat, all the cereal and the bread and everything that comes out of that. We only count the final good, the bread and the cereal, not the actual wheat. So pretty much all of the output of farmers and miners and oil drillers is not captured in GDP from that level. It's captured at the final level when they become final goods. Otherwise, we're double counting, triple counting all over the place if we do that. Okay. Okay, let me see. You'll also want to know what is not included in GDP. So if somebody buys stock in a company, that's not considered a GDP expenditure. So you want to know what is not in GDP as well as what is. And that's sort of covered in your books. It's not quite as nebulous as what it might sound. But they know about investment spending. We talked about consumption just a second ago, but investment is the I in the C plus I plus G model. And it's basically new construction. Well, first of all, it's what we call property, plant, and equipment in the accounting world. In the economic world, we call it fixed investment. These are things like machinery and equipment that go into to be used to make other goods. It also includes new construction of all kinds, but non-governmental construction. This is private construction, office buildings, retail space, things like that. Would not include things like aircraft carriers or anything like that. It would be only the private construction. And it also changes in inventories. And changes in inventories is just to account for the fact that inventories are building up and drawing down, and that as they're being built up, that's new production. As they're being drawn down, that's production from years ago being taken away, or the prior year or whatever. So know about the elements of investment, okay? And then know about what some of the trends in GDP are over time. Realizing, of course, that we've got ups and downs in the economy, and I think there's a question I think dealing with the business cycle, and we talked about that a bit for the first exam, but know basically what the trends have been over time. And also, so we talked about C and I. What about the X minus M? X minus M is that net exports figure that we talked about earlier, and that's the difference between exports and imports and what that is about, and why one is a positive to the economy, why one is a negative to the economy. And what we refer to those as, if it's negative, we call it a trade deficit. That is, if X minus M is negative, it's a trade deficit. If X minus M is positive, it's a trade surplus. Okay. Let me see here, and then we call that the trade balance. It's called the trade balance, the balance of trade, which is different than the current account balance, which is what we just talked about, which includes not just goods and services, which the trade balance only includes, but these are flows of funds. And I really debated on how much I wanted to get into this, because it really is a fairly deep subject when we get into flows of funds, because it includes things like loans. If a American bank loans an Italian company money, that would be a flow of money going out. We'd have to capture that. Or if a Chinese company invests in a firm in California, that would be a flow in. So all kinds of money flowing around the world. And that doesn't even include any discussion of banks to banks and central banks to central banks. That is, government banks, transferring money back and forth. And there is a lot of that going on. So it's a fairly deep chapter. I really only wanted to scratch the surface of this. For those of you who may go on to study finance, you will probably get much more of that, or econ, but certainly in finance, you'll get much more of that, okay? Also, know about the difference between real and nominal anything. So any kind of real value is adjusted for inflation. In other words, that value is deflated to take away the effects of inflation, since whatever base year that particular index that's used to deflate it is based upon. And when we talked about price indexes, we talked about really three main ones: the consumer price index, which deals with goods at the retail level. It also includes imports, which is somewhat problematic at times, particularly with things like oil and bulk, which are very heavily imported. There's also the PPI, which is the producer price index, measuring price changes at the wholesale level. And then there's something called the GDP deflator, which takes out those imports, because it's GDP, goods produced domestically, and tries to capture many, many more goods in that particular market basket. So it's a market basket that's being captured within that particular index. And I know there's a project, your textbook got into it, called the Billion Prices Project that MIT is trying to do. It's trying to capture every good produced everywhere. Mammoth task. It's this effort to try to get us to this giant supercomputer capturing all economic value. We're not there yet, but we may be at some point where we're capturing everything in real time. We're getting closer, we're getting better. It's not quite there yet. So the price index is used to deflate any nominal value down to some real value. So real is adjusted for inflation. Nominal is unadjusted. It's unadjusted. So like the example that a lot of us would know about, a lot of us have older relatives where they may say, I earned $5,000 a year in 1950 or whatever, and that might have been considered to be a pretty good wage in 1950. But in order for us to understand what that would be, that's a nominal figure. We'd have to pump that up for the effect of inflation. And by so doing, we could arrive at some figure that's obviously much higher because there has definitely been inflation since now in 1950. Okay, so know about the difference between real and nominal. And that will come up again and again, this idea of real everything. Real wages, nominal wages, real GDP, nominal GDP, real interest rates, nominal interest rates. All of those things will be factors in that. Okay. All right. And you can ask me questions you like if you want to. I don't think we have anything in the chat box just yet. And let's see. And I always get a little paranoid that I'm not being heard correctly, so I am always wanting to make sure you can hear me. So, okay, chapter. Let me see. Chapter 8. Yeah. I was going to say what happened in chapter 7. We didn't do chapter 7. Chapter 8 deals with unemployment. So know what the unemployment rate measures, first of all. And in fact, I gave you a formula. It's simply the number of unemployed divided by the number of people in the labor force. And to sort of delve within that, we need to know who's in the labor force. And the labor force includes everybody who's working, first of all, plus those who are looking for work. And they're considered to be actively looking for work. And we know who these people are because they tend to file for unemployment benefits where there is a job search requirement. It's not a particularly difficult burden to get over. I had a relative who I was helping file his unemployment because he didn't have a computer, and it's not that difficult to say. I sent these resumes to these companies or whatever. I filled an app online or whatever, but there is a job search requirement, but it also serves to allow us to capture those people who are in the labor force. If you're out of the labor force for whatever reason, then you're not being captured in the unemployment rate, which is a controversial aspect of the unemployment rate measure because people who are considered discouraged have fallen out. That is, they quit looking for a job, and so they're no longer in the labor force. And I think it's about a 6-month period in which they fall out. We may have extended that a bit because of COVID, our formal definition of that, but it's usually like a 6-month fallout. If you haven't found a job in 6 months, I think you begin to run out of benefits. I know those benefits were extended, in fact, quite generously through the COVID. I mean, I guess generously is a subjective term, it depends on who you ask, but they were definitely extended, no question, with COVID through a number of different initiatives. 2 or 3 different, 3 or 4 different add-ons to unemployment, which extended those benefits. But at some point, your benefits will come to an end. And therefore, if you're still looking for work, you sort of fall off the system. And so, so discouraged workers go away. And so that's from the measurement. So know who's in the labor force and who's not. Also, people who are retired, who don't work at all, are out of the labor force. And usually minors below 15 or below 16 years of age are out of the labor force as well. Also know about the types of unemployment. There are several questions dealing with the types of unemployment. So know that frictional unemployment is unemployment for a variety of reasons. Could be that somebody was terminated from their job for whatever reason, and they're taking this time off to find another job. That could be frictional unemployment. Or somebody just graduated from, say, nursing school and wants to take a few months and find the right job in the right city and whatnot, and that person will be frictionally unemployed. We're saying there's no real problem with the economy when that happens. It's simply a reality of a modern economy. people will be out of work for various reasons. Structural unemployment, though, is due to something that's really structurally wrong. Well, not wrong, but different and change. And, change is scary. And this is why it's the most difficult form, because it really requires workers to get retrained or to do some other kind of work or to physically move from wherever they are. These are not easy decisions that people have to make, but there are a lot of workers whose jobs have been displaced by structural unemployment circumstances, and those jobs are never going to come back, like elevator operators, telephone operators. I don't see them ever coming back. They just don't, there's no demand for them. So there will be some examples that you'll want to identify what kind of unemployment that we're talking about, okay? Also know about full employment, which is, your textbook refers to something called the natural rate, which is very commonly used. The natural rate of unemployment, which is somewhere between 4 and 5%, 4 and 6%, depending on who you ask. It's considered full employment. And you might say, why isn't it 0? Well, it's because there's always going to be some frictional and some structural unemployment. So the only unemployment that would exceed the natural rate or the full employment rate of unemployment is that of cyclical unemployment, which is due to poor macro conditions. So I think there's a question or two dealing with cyclical unemployment. That is unemployment not due to the worker's fault, anything the worker did, or anything the worker possesses in terms of skills. Just the economy is doing poorly, and as a result, there's a layoff. And a lot of times we see this in particular sectors that are particularly impacted by downturns in the economy. Construction, anything to do with real estate, really is oftentimes very volatile. Sometimes financial services, certainly all are examples of that. Okay, so now about the natural rate, the full employment rate of unemployment. Let me see here. Okay, I'm just going to flip it through here. So there are a number of examples of these that would be useful to know. And then know about how to compute the unemployment rate. So it's just simply the number of unemployed divided by the number in the labor force. And then if you want to make it, you're going to get it up with a decimal. And so if you end up multiplying it by 100, you get rid of the decimal. So you take so it's the total unemployed, it's a number, unemployed, divided by the number in the labor force, whatever that is. And you're going to get some number. So it's going to be like 0.00 or 0.45 or whatever. If you multiply it by 100, you get rid of that and it becomes 4.5%. Okay. All you're doing you don't have to multiply it by 100. In fact, I kind of like to leave it in decimal form because it's sort of is easier to work with computers and calculators, the input and output of those. But multiplying by 100 will make it a percentage. So that's easy to know. So that's how you compute that. And there's lots of resources within the text about how to do that. So, okay, let me see here a minute. What else do we want to know about unemployment? A couple questions dealing with cyclical unemployment. I didn't mention that. And and then also we talked a bit about the issue of underemployment, and that it misstates or has the potential to underestimate the actual rate of unemployment if we are counting as fully employed those who used to work full-time, now only work part-time. So somebody who lost their full-time job, 40 hours a week, is now only working 20 hours a week. Well, we count them as employed, but are they really as good? Are they really whole from where they were? They're really not. So full-time workers who are now working part-time are considered to be underemployed. And also a much more difficult measure, but is one that nonetheless is complicated, is those workers who are working in jobs, often temporarily because they are out of work, but who are considered to be overqualified for whatever job they've got. And as a result, they're also not working to the most of their capabilities. If you are a CPA or whatever, and you are, I don't know, working as a bookkeeper, for instance, there's nothing wrong with being a bookkeeper, but it does not pay the same wage as a CPA. That person would probably be considered underemployed, but employed, so not unemployed, just underemployed. And so that would be an example an instance in which somebody would not be working to his or her skill level. And sometimes, frankly, there's a voluntary nature of that. I mean, and I bring up that example because my brother my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, had that situation where she decided she didn't like the occupation she was working in, so she just decided to leave and go do something completely different. I think she's working at a daycare, and she's got lots of education and skills, but decided she didn't like the business world at all. So she decided to get out. And so sometimes people do that. Okay. So now who's in the labor force? Who's not in the labor force? We talked a bit about that. And let me see, I think that's about all for the unemployment bits. No, if somebody falls out of the labor force, then it means that the unemployment rate will actually go down a little bit because that person will not be considered unemployed. And so as a result, it's a problem with those who are considered discouraged because they leave the labor force, so we don't really know that they're out there. A broader measure is something called labor force participation, which sort of captures everybody who is eligible to work based upon their age. It doesn't really count the disabled that much, even though there are estimates of the number of people who can't work because of physical or mental conditions by which it doesn't allow them to work. So obviously, those people would not be technically part of the labor force, but maybe part of the calculation for what's called labor force participation, which people who are old enough to work, but so taking the labor force or the labor force divided by the that working age population, which oftentimes, and that population is got a number of different measures, but it's usually 15 to 64, right? So, or 16 to 64. So, okay. All right. Chapter 9 again deals with inflation. And just know what inflation basically is. It's general increase in the price level for pretty much all goods, not just one good. And that prices are increasing as the money is decreasing in value. That's really the flip side of that. And then also know how we measure inflation. We've got a number of different means by which we do it. And I sort of mentioned the 3 indexes, which are the most commonly cited, but they all use a hypothetical market basket that is a collection of goods by which they track the prices. It allows the analysts who compute the inflation rate to better assess those if they're simply focusing on the exact same goods month after month, year after year. So it'd be, a gallon whole milk, 1 gallon retail level, all the way across, not half gallon or quarter or whatever. It would be something like mustard, 16 ounces. You get the idea. Being very specific so that they're capturing all of those particular prices. Okay. Okay, so know about the market basket. And then know a little bit about how to compute the inflation rate. And it's a fairly simple formula where you're dividing some kind of nominal value by the price index, and then you're arriving at some sort of percentage increase from year to year. Okay, so it's the price, the value, the nominal value divided by the index value. And if you want to make it a percentage, you simply multiply that by 100. Same sort of idea. Okay, whatever the value you're measuring divided by the index value, based upon some 100 scale, like 104 or whatever, and then multiply by 100. Okay. All right. Let's see here. And then know about those 3 measures: CPI, PPI, and GDP deflator. And also know about some of the issues that there's a slide shot in the PowerPoint presentation about some of the shortcomings with GDP measure. One of those is substitution. It doesn't account for substitution. That is, if in the market basket we're capturing something like sugar, for instance, and sugar prices are rising for whatever reason. But then if consumers say, hey, wait, sugar is rising, why don't I buy sugar substitutes like Splenda or Sweet and Low or all the versions of substitutes, thereby circumventing that price increase by going on to a substitute, which may not be captured in the basket. So as a result, we may be overstating inflation because people may not be required to buy that particular good. Again, another one is the urban market basket aspect of it. where if cab fare is rising for various reasons, and you simply say, I'm not going to take the cab and ride my bike to work. Well, that is good, but what if you don't even live in a city that has taxis, right? And so as a result, that wouldn't affect you at all. So again, the rate can be overstated because of things that don't that aren't relevant. Okay. All right. Let me see here. I'm getting pretty close to the issue. So we talked about CPI, prices at the retail level. PPI is prices at the wholesale level. And when we talk about wholesale level, we're talking about goods like intermediate goods, like plastics, for instance, big, huge rolls of plastic or steel, on big columns of steel. Those are not goods that are ready for final sale that are to be used by somebody else, or the output of farmers, for instance. Even though we don't capture it in GDP, we capture it as it goes down into GDP. We will capture the price change at that wholesale level, because that change in the wholesale price level oftentimes works its way through to the retail level as measured by the CPI. Okay, and then also we talked about the GDP deflator, which is a more comprehensive index, which captures most goods and nets out imports, takes imports out. Okay, we also talked about some other forms of sort of alternative forms of inflation. One of those being deflation. That's basically it changes the price level downward. In other words, negative inflation is deflation. So you want to know what that is, and that's and I guess that we've only really had one instance of deflation, really, in I think all of our lifetimes. And when I say that, I'm assuming that there's nobody in the class who was around 90 years ago, which was the last time prior to that period that we had true deflation. But it was in 2009. Deflation is a much less common phenomenon, but it also is a very much of a warning sign, because it's symptomatic of an economy that's in really bad shape. We also talked about hyperinflation, where the inflation rate is surging thousands of percent per year because of usually a currency and currency management that's simply out of control. That's a pretty good definition there. So it's a pretty good issue, example of that. Okay. And let me see here a minute. Okay. Bear with me here a minute. Are there any questions for me while I'm sort of scrolling through here? Some of these I've covered, and okay, and I've only got just the last bit to talk about here, chapter 10, and that deals with the things we just talked about this morning here in class. Know about the what exports are, what imports are. Exports, goods sold to foreign buyers. Imports, purchased from foreign sellers. And know that the difference between exports and imports represents the balance of trade, trade surplus, trade deficit, and know when one is a trade deficit, when one is in surplus. And then know about the current account. The current account basically captures not only the trade balance, but it also breaks down between goods and services. And it also includes some of the financial flows, like income received, that is investment income, earnings, and also unilateral transfers like simple gifts, foreign aid, that sort of thing. Lots of countries give foreign aid to other countries, so that would be included in that. So know what is included in that. And let me see here. I think that is about it. Oh, and then one final question is this, and this goes to your textbook. There's a question about whether or not trade deficits or surpluses are good or bad. And just read that section of the book, because it's interesting. It'll help you to sort of understand some of these, because a lot of times we have this idea of deficits, oh, bad, surplus is good. Maybe, maybe not, right? And so kind of get a feel for that, if you would. Now kind of give you an idea of where that question is going, okay? So anyway, are there questions for me about anything that I've talked about here? I'm wrapping up a little bit early, but I can hang around for a bit if anybody wants to chat with me. But and I'm sort of looking here to see. So okay, well, otherwise, if there are no questions, feel free to get with me between now and Thursday, or you can even wait and save up your questions for Thursday. I will be here at 9 o'clock and prepared to, and if nobody shows up, nobody shows up. It's not a big deal. I'm paid to be here anyway, so it's not a big deal. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions, because I realize as you're studying for an exam, you may say, well, I just don't really get this. What did he say about this? What did he say about, I get that. So that's a good time to get with me, and or anytime for that matter, I'm available to you. Okay. All right. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see you next time.